In this video, I'm going to start laying the main line of my model railway to run from here all the way over to here in N gauge. How hard can that be? Okay, so I spent quite a long time playing around with the track that I've got laid so far, testing the points, testing the locos. I've done some DCC conversions on my locos as well, and giving it a good run and getting used to iTrain and working out how that all works. And if you're interested in any of that, have a look at some of my previous videos. You can see all the trials and tribulations I've had trying to get all that stuff running. But now I've got to a point where I'm quite confident that I know what I'm doing. Let's see, and I'm going to start laying some more track. All the track that I've laid so far is in fact going to be hidden. It's basically the basement level, the underground level, where I'll be able to store trains when they're not running on the scenic areas of my layout. But now I'm going to start laying track in the scenic areas. So this is going to be the first appearance of the main line out of a tunnel. And it's going to emerge 4 tracks from a tunnel mouth around about here somewhere and run along behind me to the join where this section of the layout joins on with this other section to my left here. So all I've got to do is lay 4 straight tracks. It shouldn't seem so difficult, but of course the trouble is that I need to get the elevations right, because while the middle 2 tracks will stay on a low level, the two outside tracks will rise up alongside it, and eventually one of the tracks will then pass across the 2 middle in a bridge, and they will separate and go in different directions. And I need to get the elevations just right. I need to get the heights just right at all the various points along the run so that the locomotives will run properly. Now, so far, all my sub-road bed has been 6mm MDF. Now, 6mm MDF is not a very sensible choice. The reason for this is that MDF absorbs moisture. And that then causes it to sag and bow under its own weight. So after a while, I can expect each little length of track between supports to develop a little bow. And as the trains run over the track, they'll be going up and down and up and down and up and down. And obviously that makes for really bad running. Now, I was aware of this problem. And so I've tried to prevent that happening in 2 ways. Firstly, by sealing the MDF. I paint some sort of magic sealant on it, which should prevent it from taking up moisture. And the other way is to put reinforcements on the underneath of the sub-road bed, perpendicular to the roadbed, so it effectively forms a T-section. And that'll obviously give it a lot more strength. And I think I can carry on doing that. And certainly all the sections that I've laid so far, even the first bits that I laid, whatever it was, 2.5, 3 years ago over here, those don't show any sign of sagging or bowing, but then they are all reinforced and they've all been sealed. So in order to start building this next section of the layout, I need some MDF. And here I've got a sheet of 6mm MDF, and I've laid it around about in the area that I'm going to build my track. Now I transfer my track plan from the computer onto the model by printing out sections of the plan in 1:1 scale, full size. And that's what I've got here. I've got several pieces of A3, and you can see there are 4 tracks that I've laid out. So I will place these on the piece of MDF, Eventually what I'll do is I will glue them in place, and then I'll use that as a template to cut out the piece of wood. There we go, that is around about how my main lines are going to appear. So they're going to come out of the tunnel mouth here, having gone into the tunnel in order to turn around and come back, and then this gentle sweeping bend leading up to this end where there'll be a bridge, and the two middle tracks will pass underneath the outside one. So what I'm going to do now is get serious, start laying out the track on the piece of wood, and getting ready to make some cuts. So I can now just move along and do the next one. Now, I am aware that I've just made a video showing you how to sellotape pieces of paper together. And you may well think you didn't need to watch a video to be taught how to do that. You'd be right. However, this whole process is about precision. It's about, as accurately as we can, transferring what the computer very precisely designed, and the reason I used a computer was to get the curves just perfect, and the easements in and out of the curves, and all the alignments and all the rest of it. And there's no point in doing that unless I'm going to then precisely transfer that onto the actual model. If I'm going to just guess at it when I build it, well, I might as well not have bothered designing it properly in the first place. Okay, so the next step is to stick the layout plan onto the MDF. In the past I've used just tiny little dabs of wood glue to do this, but what I got to hand today is this Hobbycraft sort of craft PVA, so it's just sort of cheap diluted PVA, and I'm sure that'll do the job. So I will just go and pop a little bit under each corner. Just a few places, and just sort of keep it stuck down. So I think, to be honest, I probably used a bit too much glue here, but it's not the end of the world. That's the reason I'm using this sort of cheap school glue, is so that it's easy to get the paper off once I've marked the pattern through. Okay, so the glue's dried. I've moved onto a slightly sturdier table because what I'm going to do next, I don't want to damage the layout. The next step is to mark all the significant points from the plan onto the MDF. And in particular, that means the centre line of each track. So I do that using just a small little panel pin here. Hold it in the pliers to make that a bit easier. And then I just place it on the line and give it a tap with a hammer. And I do this various spots along the line. Because these curves are very sort of broad and sweeping, I don't really need to do it very often. On a tighter curve, obviously you'll need to mark the centre line more frequently. so when you join up the dots, you get a better curve. There's a few other points I want to mark, in particular where these cross pieces are, just so that I can make sure that they all ends up in the right place. But for this particular piece of sub road bed, to be honest, it's pretty straight, and it just goes from one point to another, so I can't really get it too far wrong. But it's important to make sure that we mark everything in the correct place. So having marked all the important lines, it's time to cut a rough outline with a jigsaw. I'm doing this outside because MDF creates a really unpleasant dust that's bad for your health. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just get a small piece of hardboard or another piece of MDF or something, stick it across the join and glue it together. I think, I can stick some weights on the top. I think that's the way to do it. Further, I need to paint a coat of sealant on the MDF. This will prevent it from absorbing moisture and so stop it from warping, which is the big problem with MDF. Over time it sucks up the moisture in the air and then it starts to droop. We don't want a droopy roadbed. This is the first sort of just test fit, just placing this board in place. You can see up at this end, this is where these 4 tracks will link into the loop that goes round, and then they'll continue along here, sweeping curve, and then eventually at the far end the 2 side tracks rise up, and the one on the right in particular will then cross over the middle 2 on a bridge, and they'll separate. Now, I've placed some very rough supports underneath just to hold it in place, but the next thing I need to do is to cut those supports to the right height and get it just right. So I'll show you how I do that. Okay, so I use this table saw in order to make precise cuts when I'm doing woodwork. I'm no expert at using a table saw. The primary goal is not to chop your fingers off, and I haven't done that yet. And obviously I hope I never will. But don't take any advice from me on how to actually operate the saw. I'm quite sure I'm doing things wrong. And I'd hate to be responsible for someone making a bad decision. Table saw creates a lot of dust, so I hook up my hoover to it to try and suck up the dust. Obviously, making cuts in the railway room, creating a lot of dust isn't a good thing. I don't mind doing it at the moment because I've not got the scenic element of the build. But once I'm building scenery, I wouldn't want to be cutting any wood or creating any dust in the railway room. Now, the first piece that I need to build as a stand for this bit of sub-road bed, it needs to be about 80 millimeters. That doesn't matter too much. That's the width, but the height is very precise, and that needs to be 70.5 millimeters. Now, the half a millimeter, that makes a difference when you're trying to get inclines nice and smooth and accurate. What I'm going to try and do is to cut it within, 1 or 2 tenths of a millimetre, and I'll show you how I do that. So the first thing is just to cut the width. So I can set this to 80 millimetres using the guide on the table saw. The guide on the table saw is not terribly accurate, but this cut doesn't really matter too much. In order to see what I've actually cut, I'm going to use my calipers. And although I set the table saw to be 80, that's actually come out as 80.6. Now that doesn't matter too much because it's the width, but it's the height that really matters to me, and that is 71.2. So I need to take off 0.7 of a millimetre. So what I'll do is I will position the guide so it's pretty much where the piece is. Obviously this is a very small amount to take off actually on a first cut, but I'll run it through and see where we are. Point is I can now measure it. That is 70.8, 70.6, 70.8. So I think I need to take off 0.2 of a millimetre. So what I can do now, without paying attention to what the actual figures are, by eye I can move the guide a fraction of a millimetre. And the way I'll do this is with my eye I'll line the edge here up on the guide and then just rotate my thumb just a tiny amount to move it and then lock it back in place. So I'll run it through again and hopefully it'll just take off that fraction of a millimetre to get me to the height that I want it to be. Measure the width now. I've possibly overdone it. 70.3, 70.3, 70.7, not sure about that. No, 70.3. So I think I've taken off 0.2 of a millimetre too much, but that means I am within 0.2 of a millimetre of my target. So that's actually pretty good, and I'm going to give that a go. So you can see here I've placed the temporarily just placed the stand in place, and that's holding the roadbed nicely. just the way I want it to. It's not sort of overstressing it, but it is in contact. So I'm happy with that cut. Now, of course, the next step is to glue a couple of pieces on here like this in order so that I can attach it to the frame. And I find the best way of doing this is just to simply glue it. So here I'm just marking where to cut the sub roadbed so that it fits in perfectly. And of course now I need to mark where to glue the uprights into so they're in the right position. This is my first proper look at the shape of the sub roadbed. I think I'm pretty pleased with the way it's come out so far. So it's a good time for me to talk about some of the mistakes that I've made. They're all based just here. So let me show you. If I take this piece of sub roadbed out of the way, when I was building the frame, I thought it was important to get these heights right and build them into it. And so I cut this rather complicated shape into the frame with a view to the fact that the sub roadbeds would attach on these points here. Now that was the best part of 3 years ago, and since then the track design has changed a bit. Not a lot, but I've just regraded a lot of the slopes in order to try and get a shallower grade in general on the main line. I realised there was various changes I could make to optimise it, and as a consequence it means that these two heights need to be changed. So somehow I need to cut the top off both of them, and I'll explain in a moment how I'm going to do that. Now I did do a similar thing just here where I regraded this slope here because I moved it back to starting at this point, and that meant I had to chop the top off here as well. So I do know there's a way of doing it. The other problem I've got is this particular piece of wood here, this particular piece of plywood, is I built using a piece of plywood where there was a warp, and I'll show you here. You can see just how warped it is. Now this isn't very good because I need the ends where the two boards connect to be flat and to join together in the right place. So somehow I need to change this, and I think what I'm going to do, because I would have attached here on, I will attach here on these faces pieces of oak in order to give me a really firm anchor to attach not just the sub roadbed but the copper clad sleepers that I'm going to solder the rail ends to. So I'm going to have an oak foundation here. So it doesn't, I'm not relying too much on the strength of the plywood at this point, but I would like it to be straight. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drill holes into this piece of wood, and I'm going to try and soak some water in order to make the plywood a bit more malleable, and then I'm going to try and stretch it back into shape so that I can get the ends nice and flat where the two boards join together. So now I've drilled some holes here. I'm going to just attach a wet cloth and probably leave that there overnight and see if I can get some water to soak into the plywood and make it a little bit more flexible so I can straighten it out. So I've separated the two parts of my layout by undoing the bolts, and that's going to allow me to get another cloth in behind on the other side of this piece of wood and hopefully soften it up, and with any luck I will be able to straighten it out. Okay, so I've let this soak for a couple of hours, and now you can see I've put this piece of oak here, which should stay pretty rigid. I've put that alongside the plywood and clamped it up, and the hope is that overnight it will dry out, and it will dry keeping a bit more of the shape it's got now with the clamp on. So if I show you a few up the edge, that sort of straightened up that piece that had a bit of a bend to it. So I think we just got to wait till the morning and see if this has worked. Okay, well, it's the next day. I've taken the straps, the clamps off this piece of wood I was trying to straighten out. If we just have a look, that's not quite perfect, but it's almost there. And I'd say that's probably good enough. So the next thing I'm going to do is to cut those two riser pieces to the right height, and then attach some blocks of oak to screw into. So my plan for cutting these pieces to the right height is to first attach this template that I've made. I'll put it the other way around. Now I've flattened this edge here. I've cut it after it's been together, so that's perfectly level, which means if I slide it on like this, then the height along the bottom is the same as what these two tabs are going to give me. So I can put that on there, and what that means now is I can run it through the table saw and cut it to the appropriate height, and then I can put it on here and use it as a template. And 5.6. So I do this by just by eye on the gauge here, just gently moving the guide across. So now I can place my guide here on the workpiece, and depending on how exactly I do it, perhaps I'll just put it on the other way around. There, you can see there's probably a millimetre needs to be taken off the top. I will just try and clamp this in place. So now I've sorted all the levels out, I can offer up the crack bed, the sub-road bed, and see how well it fits. So pleasingly the two ends come to right up to the end there. That's quite nice. I think that's pretty much the way it should be. So here I'm using a piece of 2mm hardboard for the roadbed instead of 2mm cork. The thickness is the same, but the hardboard is obviously a lot stiffer. It doesn't have any give in it, and the reason I'm using hardboard at the end here is because I'm going to attach a copper clad sleeper. I'm going to screw it into the oak foundation, and if I use cork, then that'll give it a little bit of movement, which I don't want. So I always lay cork in two halves. I lay the first half up to the centre line, and that way once it's laid I can still see where the centre line runs, and then I can lay the second half next to it. And once both halves are down, I can still see the centre line marked as the join between the two, in order to make sure I put the track in the right place. just before I put the last piece of track in, I think I'm going to do for this video, I just want to show you something that I've learned. So here we've got a join in the track, and I've been using these extra sleepers to fill in the gap that you get. Now what I've realised is that the closest that I can close up this gap is the length of a joiner, but unfortunately the length of a joiner is just a little bit more than the length between two sleepers. So when you put the extra sleeper in, it's not quite evenly spaced. Now you'll see those 1, 2, 3 are slightly closer together than the next one's 1, 2, 3, and this is the extra sleeper. So to try and get around this problem, I've deliberately here left a slightly larger gap, and I've put in 2 dummy sleepers, which is this one and this one. That's an insulated rail joiner, and that's a normal rail joiner, a metal one. And if I've got it all set up right, I should be able to attach the next piece of track, and it should be evenly spaced. There we go. So you can see I've got 2 sleepers there across the join, but the sleeper spacing is better. Now I've made a bit of a mess of this because I've left a little bit of a joint there. Well, it's always a good idea to have a bit of a gap to allow for thermal expansion in your rails, but it's a little bit larger than I wanted. Once it's glued down, I'll try and tap it along a bit. But that doesn't always work because I've soldered dropper wires to the underneath of the rail rather than doing it on the side of the rail after I've got the track in place. So that's something I need to find a way around. So the glue I always use is Copydex. It's Chadwick Charlie who got me into that habit. I'm not sure it's strictly necessary. I expect there's other glues that work perfectly well, but it's what I do and I've got used to it. I have to say it does make it a lot easier to pull the track up again if you make a mistake. Now I say this is my last piece of track that I'm doing for this video. That's in fact because I've run out of track and I'm going to have to wait for a delivery of some more track before I can make any more progress.